I never thought that the smell of blooming jasmine in my garden in Montevideo would one day feel like the scent of a funeral. I remember the exact second the shadow fell over my life. It wasn't a monster from a movie, but a woman in a silk dress with a smile as cold as a marble tombstone. Her name was Dona Faustina, my mother-in-law, and she didn't just want to be part of my family. She wanted to be the architect of my soul. In the high society circles of Uruguay, the name de Silva carried weight, and Faustina wore that weight like a crown of thorns she forced everyone else to kiss. From the moment I began my life with Mateo, I felt the invisible threads tightening. Mateo was the younger son, the one who chose the architecture of buildings over the architecture of Lisa's mother preferred. His older brother Santiago had already been molded into the perfect puppet. Santiago's wife, Lucia, was the crown jewel of Faustina's collection. They weren't just in-laws. Their families had shared secrets for generations over glasses of Tannat in the vineyards of Canelones. Lucia was everything I wasn't: refined, predictable, and, most importantly, completely broken by Faustina's will. The intrigue began long before the first legal document touched our door. I noticed how Faustina would look at my stomach with a hunger that wasn't grandmotherly. It was predatory. You see, the great tragedy of the De Silva legacy was Lucia's infertility. In Faustina's twisted mind, a house without a biological heir was a house in ruins. But instead of supporting Lucia, Faustina began a campaign of psychological warfare. She whispered that the lineage must continue at any cost. And when I announced my pregnancy, the air in the family villa turned poisonous. I found strange talismans hidden in my bedside drawer, dried lavender, tied with black thread, an old Uruguayan superstition for transferring life. I thought it was just senile obsession, that then the letters started arriving, unsigned, written on vintage stationery, warning me that my child was already promised to another. As my pregnancy progressed, we retreated to a small house on the coast of Rocha, hoping the sound of the Atlantic would drown out the whispers of the city. But Faustina's reach was longer than the coastline. Lucia began showing up unannounced, her eyes hollow and her hands trembling. She didn't come to congratulate me. She came to touch the baby through my skin, her touch lingering a second too long, her nails scratching the fabric of my dress. She spoke of the baby as if he were a reincarnation of a De Silva ancestor, someone who belonged in the grand library of their estate, not in our saltiered cottage. One evening, while Mateo was in the city finalizing a contract, I found a leather-bound diary hidden in the guest room where Lucia had stayed. It wasn't Lucia's, it belonged to Faustina, dating back 30 years. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, the detective in me, the girl who grew up questioning every silence in my own family, realized I wasn't just dealing with a jealous mother-in-law. I was dealing with a legacy of theft. The diary detailed arrangements made decades ago. Children moved from one branch of the family to another to ensure the purity of the inheritance. Faustina wasn't just obsessed with Lucia. She was repeating a crime she had committed before. The atmosphere shifted from drama to a cold-blooded thriller when the first incident happened. My brakes failed on the winding roads near Polonio. If it weren't for a sandy embankment, I would have been another tragic headline in the El País. When the mechanic looked at the car, he didn't find wear and tear. He found a clean cut. Someone wanted me gone, but they wanted the cargo I was carrying to survive. That was the night I realized that in this family, I was merely a vessel, a biological printer for a legacy they intended to hijack. Faustina started calling me every hour, her voice dripping with artificial honey. asking about the family's heartbeat, never mentioning mine. The recovery from the accident in Rocha was a fevered dream of white, hospital walls and Faustina's suffocating presence. She didn't leave my side, not out of love, but to ensure I didn't whisper the word sabotage to any passing nurse. It was then that the first real blow fell. A man in a sharp gray suit, representing the Instituto del Niño Adolescente del Uruguay INAU, arrived at my room. He didn't come to check on my well-being. He came because of an anonymous report regarding my mental stability and reckless behavior that led to the crash. Faustina sat in the corner, her fingers dancing over a rosary, her face a mask of practiced tragedy. She had weaponized the state against me. The report suggested that the trauma of the pregnancy had induced a psychotic break, making me a danger to the unborn heir of the De Silva name. I looked at Mateo, searching for the fire I knew was there, but his eyes were hollow. He avoided my gaze, focusing instead on the blueprints of a new project in Punta del Este. Every time I tried to speak about the cut brake lines, he would hush me, claiming I was confused. By the shock, the betrayal felt sharper than any glass from the windshield. Was he protecting me from his mother? Or was he part of the architecture she was building around my life? I realized then that in the De Silva family, silence wasn't just golden, it was a survival tactic. Lucia, meanwhile, began preparing a nursery in the main villa in Montevideo, buying hand-carved cribs from artisans in Colonia del Sacramento, acting as if the child I was carrying was already hers to claim. The detective work became a matter of survival. While they thought I was sleeping, I used my phone to dig into the De Silva finances. I discovered that the family vineyards in Canelones were failing, drowning in debt that even their prestigious name couldn't cover. But there was a massive insurance policy, a trust fund tied specifically to a male heir born within the next year. It wasn't just about legacy. It was about the gold. Faustina didn't just want a grandchild. She wanted a financial lifeline. And she had chosen Lucia to hold the strings because Lucia owed her everything. My child was nothing more than a transaction, a piece of meat to be traded for the survival of a dying empire. Desperate for answers, I escaped the hospital with the help of an old friend from my university days, a woman who knew the dark underbelly of Montevideo's elite. We drove through the night to the De Silva estate in Canelones, a place of crumbling grandeur and rows of vines that looked like skeletal fingers, reaching for the moon. I remembered the diary and a specific mention of a cellar beneath the old press. While the family was distracted by my disappearance, I broke into the estate. The air was thick with the smell of fermenting grapes and centuries of secrets. I found a hidden compartment behind a rack of vintage Tanat, not gold or jewels, but a collection of birth certificates and legal waivers. What I found chilled my blood. More than the winds of the Rio de la Plata. There were 3 certificates for children born 30 years ago, all with the De Silva name, but only 2 were ever accounted for. One name was crossed out in Faustina's jagged handwriting, Esteban. I realized then that Santiago and Mateo might not be the only sons, or perhaps they weren't who they thought they were. I found a correspondence between Faustina and Lucia's mother, Beatriz. They hadn't just been best friends, they were accomplices in a long-term scheme of identity theft. Lucia wasn't just infertile. She was part of a biological replacement program that Faustina had run for decades to maintain control over the family's vast landholdings. As I was about to leave, the heavy oak door of the cellar creaked open. It wasn't a guard or a thief. It was Santiago, the perfect older brother. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked exhausted. He held a glass of dark wine, his hands shaking. He told me that he knew why I was there, and that he had been waiting for someone to finally find the courage to look into the shadows. But then came the twist that nearly stopped my heart. Santiago wasn't there to help me. He told me that Mateo had known about the INAU report before it was filed. Mateo wasn't the victim of his mother's manipulation. He was the one who had suggested it to keep me safe under their roof. My husband, the man I thought was my shield, was the one who had tightened the noose. Standing in that cold cellar, I felt the world tilt. Santiago's words were like slow-acting poison, paralyzing my heart before it could scream. Mateo, my Mateo, wasn't the man who had sat by my side dreaming of a small house in the countryside. He was a De Silva through and through, a man who viewed loyalty as a currency to be traded for safety. Santiago explained that Esteban wasn't just a name on a paper. He was the original heir, a child born from a previous marriage that Faustina had erased from the family. Records to ensure her own sons inherited the vast vineyards of Canelones, but the inheritance was locked behind a clause that required a direct biological continuation of the Lina, male child born on the Silva soil. My child was the only thing standing between them and total financial ruin. Santiago showed me a photograph hidden inside a ledger. It was a young man who looked hauntingly like Mateo, but with eyes that held a darkness I had never seen. Esteban didn't die, Santiago whispered into the heavy air. He was hidden away, a secret shame that Faustina used to keep us in line. And now Mateo is using you to replace him in the ledger of history. I realized that the psychotic break they were framing me for was the perfect cover. If I were declared unfit, Faustina and Lucia would take the baby, and I would be moved to a private clinic in the outskirts of Minas, a place where people like me were forgotten behind high stone walls and heavy sedation. The realization ignited a cold, hard fire in my chest. I wasn't just a mother fighting for her child anymore. I was a detective solving my own murder before it could happen. I took photos of the documents with my phone, the flash illuminating the damp walls like lightning. Santiago didn't stop me. He seemed to want the house of cards to fall, even if it crushed him too. As I climbed the stairs back to the surface, I knew I couldn't go back to the hospital. I had to go back to the Lion's Den, the main villa in Montevideo. I had to play the role of the broken wife long enough to find the one piece of evidence that could bring Faustina's empire down, the original trust agreement that mentioned Esteban's existence. Returning to the villa was like walking into a gilded cage. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying rot of old secrets. Faustina welcomed me with a hug that felt like a snake's coil, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of defiance. I played my part, weeping softly, apologizing for my erratic behavior, and thanking them for their protection. I saw Lucia in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She looked at me not with hatred, but with a terrifying kind of pity. She was already living in the nursery, surrounded by blue blankets and silver rattles, a woman who had traded her soul for a role in a play she didn't write. Mateo was there, acting the part of the concerned husband. Every time he touched my hand, I felt a jolt of revulsion, but I forced myself to lean into him. I needed him to believe I was broken. That night, while the house slept under the watchful eye of security cameras, I crept into the library. I knew the trust documents weren't in a safe. Faustina was too arrogant for that. They were hidden in plain sight, likely within the very books that chronicled the family's history. My search was frantic but silent. I found a leather-bound volume titled The History of the Canelons Vineyards. Inside, tucked between the pages describing the 1974 harvest, was the black clause. It stated that if an heir was found to be fraudulent, the entire estate would revert to a national charity. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I found a recent bank transfer to a private investigator. They weren't just watching me, they were looking for Esteban. They were afraid he was coming back to claim what was his. The intrigue deepened. What if Esteban wasn't the villain in this story? What if he was the only one who could help me? As I stood in the moonlight of the library, the front door chime echoed through the house. It was 3 a.m. I watched from the shadows as a man entered the foyer. He wasn't a guard. He had the same jawline as Mateo, the same gait as Santiago. It was the ghost himself. Esteban had arrived not to claim the land, but to collect a debt that had been simmering for 30 years. The man standing in the foyer wasn't a ghost, but he was a haunting reminder of what happens to those who defy Faustina. Esteban's eyes were like the gray waters of the Rio de la Plata during a storm cold, deep and unforgiving. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a cigarette, lighting it with a silver lighter that bore the De Silva crest. I stayed in the shadows of the library, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then I heard a second set of footsteps. Mateo. I braced myself for a confrontation, for shouts, for the sound of a struggle. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. "You're late," Mateo said, his voice devoid of the warmth I had once loved. "The documents are ready." My world shattered again. Mateo wasn't just a passive observer. He was negotiating with the very threat Faustina feared. I watched from behind the heavy velvet curtains as they spread papers across the mahogany table. It wasn't a ransom note, it was a merger. Mateo was offering Esteban a percentage of the offshore accounts in exchange for his continued non-existence. They were trading my child's future for their own survival. Esteban laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He told Mateo that he didn't want the money. He wanted the villa in Pointer del the place where his own mother had been discarded, like a broken toy. He wanted to sit in the seat of power and watch Faustina wither away. The detective in me realized that I was the only person in that house who wasn't playing for money. I was playing for a life. I waited until Esteban left, disappearing into the humid Montevideo night. Before I confronted Mateo, I didn't scream. I walked out of the shadows, holding the black claws in my shaking hand. The look on Mateo's face wasn't guilt. It was a terrifying kind of exhaustion. He told me that he was doing this to save us. He claimed that if Faustina went down, we all went down. The debts, the scandals, the criminal investigations into the vineyard's labor practices. He said he was building a bridge out of the fire, but all I saw were the ashes of our marriage. I realized then that I couldn't trust the man I slept next to. In the De Silva family, love was just another form of leverage. I had 4 hours before sunrise, 4 hours to execute a plan that would either save me or bury me in a psychiatric ward in Minas. I didn't pack a suitcase. I only took my passport, the documents from the cellar, and a small silver crucifix that belonged to my own grandmother, only thing in that house that wasn't tainted by greed. I contacted the only person Faustina couldn't buy, an old journalist from El Observador, who had been trying to crack the Dr. Silva shell for decades. We agreed to meet at a nondescript cafe near the port market. As I tried to slip out the back entrance, the lights in the garden flared to life. Faustina was standing there, draped in a white dressing gown, looking like a vengeful spirit. She didn't have guards with her. She didn't need them. Her voice was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. She told me that she knew about the black clause, and she knew about my meeting with the journalist. She smiled, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of her madness. She whispered that the INAU agents were already on their way, not to take the baby later, but to take me now for endangering the pregnancy by attempting to flee. She had anticipated my every move, turning my quest for freedom into evidence of my instability. But Faustina had overlooked one thing: Santiago, the perfect brother, the man broken by her will, had finally found a reason to snap. From the balcony above, Santiago dropped a heavy iron key, the key to the old service tunnel that led directly to the street. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes was a silent plea for forgiveness. I grabbed the key and ran. I could hear Faustina's screams behind me, no longer composed, but shrill and panicked. I realized then that her power was entirely based on the silence of others. Once I stepped into that tunnel, the silence was broken. I wasn't just running from a family. I was running towards a war that would dismantle an empire built on stolen lives. The service tunnel was damp, smelling of earth and old wine, but to me, it was the scent of a new life. I emerged into a narrow alleyway near the port market, my lungs burning from the cold night air. Valerio, the journalist, was waiting in a battered car that looked like a relic from the 1950s. The perfect disguise in a city where status was everything. I handed him the digital files and the physical documents, my hands finally stopping their tremble. I told him everything: the stolen identities, the financial fraud, the staged accident, and the weaponization of the INAU as the sun began to bleed over the horizon of the Rio de la Plata. I watched the first headlines go live on the El Observador website. It wasn't just a scandal. It was an earthquake that leveled the De Silva name in a matter of hours. The police raid on the villa happened at noon from a safe house in the Prado district. I watched the live news coverage as Faustina was led out in handcuffs, her face still a mask of aristocratic defiance, though her eyes betrayed a flickering fear. They found the black claws, and they found the evidence of the bribe Mateo had tried to pay Esteban. But the biggest twist came from Esteban himself. He didn't just disappear after the meeting. He went straight to the authorities with a recording of the entire negotiation. He wasn't the monster Faustina had painted him to be. He was a man who had spent 30 years waiting for the right moment to reclaim his existence by destroying the woman who had erased him. He wasn't interested in the money. He wanted the truth, to be the only legacy left of the De Silva family. Lucia was taken for questioning too, but her spirit had already been broken years ago. She confessed to everything, revealing that Faustina had planned to have me committed the very day I was supposed to give birth. The depth of the depravity was staggering. My husband, Mateo, was arrested as an accomplice. His protection revealed as a calculated move to secure the trust fund. As I sat in the quiet garden of the safe house, feeling the baby kick with a renewed vigor, I realized that the house of cards hadn't just fallen, it had turned to dust. The detective work was over, and the legal battle had begun, but for the first time in months, the shadows in the corner of the room didn't look like monsters. They were just shadows. 6 months later, the dust has finally settled. Faustina is serving a lengthy sentence for fraud and conspiracy. Her empire dismantled and the vineyards and canelones sold to a national cooperative. Mateo's trial is still ongoing, but I haven't looked back. I signed the divorce papers in a cold room in the courthouse, never once meeting his eyes. He tried to write me letters, claiming he was forced by his mother's threats, but I burned them without reading. In the end, he was just another architect who built a house on a foundation of lies. Santiago, surprisingly, was the only one who didn't face charges. His cooperation with the prosecution and the key he gave me were seen as acts of redemption. He now lives a quiet life in the countryside, tending to a small garden far from the poison of his mother's legacy. I moved to Colonia del Sacramento, a place where the cobblestone streets and the slow pace of the river feel like a healing balm. My son, whom I named Tiagoa, named that belongs to Nona Silva, and sisters, the light of my life, he has my eyes and a spirit that is entirely his own. We live in a small, sun-drenched house where the only smell of jasmine comes from the bushes I planted myself, and it no longer smells like a funeral. I spend my days working as a consultant for an NGO that helps women navigate the very legal systems Faustina tried to use against me. I've turned my trauma into a shield for others, and in doing so, I've finally found the peace that the De Silva villa could never provide. Sometimes, when the moon is full over the river, I think back to that night in the cellar in the Black Claws. I realize that the greatest mystery wasn't the hidden heir or the stolen money. It was the strength I didn't know I had. I am no longer a vessel or a piece of a legacy. I am the author of my own story. The detective in me is still there, but now she looks for beauty instead of betrayal. As I watch Tiago sleep, I know that we are safe. The shadows of Montevideo are far behind us, and the horizon here is wide, clear, and full of promise. We didn't just survive the De Silva Empire. We outlived it, and that is the only victory that truly matters.